Hi, welcome to another Onwards and Upwards education video. This one is Year 8 History 1.3 and it's all about treatment and response to the Black Death in Europe, Asia and Africa. Sickness was nothing unfamiliar to people living in the 14th century, and they knew only too well that illness often led to death. The fact that the Black Death struck at a time of famine and unusually cold weather made it even more difficult to overcome. So if we have a look here at the weather patterns in Europe, we can see a little spike around the time that the Black Death hit. So they had enjoyed pretty warm, moderate sorts of temperatures up until that point, and then suddenly it got cold, and they obviously weren't expecting it. At that time, in the High Middle Ages, due to the incredible importance of religion in daily life, the most highly recommended treatment for any illness was actually prayer. Medical science was strictly controlled by the church, as was practically every other aspect of society, and it hadn't advanced for many years. Ordinary people were generally very superstitious and had no knowledge of medicine. Most of what was known about medical science and anatomy in the 14th century in Europe came from the work of Galen and Hippocrates, and they were both Greek physicians who had lived many centuries earlier. There they are, pretty attractive fellas. Living in Rome during the 2nd century, Galen was a physician who used to dissect animals to learn about anatomy, which at the time was very progressive. He would have dissected humans, of course, but that was illegal. Galen came up with theories about the brain, the nervous system, and the circulatory system. And later on, when people like Da Vinci were able to dissect human bodies, many of Galen's original theories were actually proved incorrect. However, that doesn't take away from the fact that for hundreds of years, Galen's work was very highly regarded. In fact, doctors at the time of the Black Death refused to acknowledge any views on medical science that didn't agree with Galen's theories. Some 600 years before Galen came on the scene, another Greek physician named Hippocrates was one of the first people to propose that illness was not, in fact, a result of being cursed by the gods, but rather illness and disease were a part of nature, or related to biology. He even went so far as to suggest that lifestyle factors like diet and hygiene had some influence on illness and disease. The work of Hippocrates was not necessarily popular with church authorities in the Middle Ages, but it was widely regarded as fundamental knowledge in the field of medical science. Keeping in mind that when we're talking about medical treatment in the Middle Ages, the first person usually called for when someone fell ill was the local priest. After that, a doctor might be called for, but not necessarily. Priests were far more highly regarded than doctors in those days. Doctors were permitted to help the attending priest in some situations, or they might have been allowed to examine the patient after prayers had been offered. Wealthy patients would often actually have a large group of priests say prayer for them, so in some cases the doctor didn't get to examine the patient until after they died. When doctors did get the chance to treat the sick, some of their preferred methods of the time were bloodletting, which involved draining blood from the body to remove impurities, applying leeches to the skin, which had much the same purpose as the bloodletting, and it was all about trying to restore balance. There were some herbal medicines which were used by some, but they weren't very sophisticated potions, and regularly they contained poisonous substances. These were often more dangerous than the disease. And then surgery, which was not very common and usually basically restricted to just amputations of injured or diseased limbs. And this was actually performed by barbers, not doctors, which is just astonishing to think of. Unsurprisingly, probably, it was rarely successful. So a belief that became increasingly common, and was probably sort of accurate, was that breathing in bad smells, which there were obviously plenty of in dirty, crowded towns, helped to spread the disease. So doctors started recommending that people keep a posy, which is like a little bundle, of flowers, herbs, or sweet-smelling oils on them at all times for sniffing, so that they could try and filter out these bad smells. Doctors themselves, noticing that a lot of doctors were starting to catch the plague, they started wearing long robes with hoods when they visited the sick to try and protect themselves. Some of them also used face masks with beaks in them to put the flowers, herbs, and oils in so they didn't have to carry them around. So that's a little posy there on the left, and then this is sort of a re-representation of what one of those masks might have looked at that the doctors wore. So there were some treatments that actually worked, according to some of the documentation that historians have found. The most successful measures taken to avoid the plague were those that involved forms of quarantine. In Venice, disease-carrying ships were quarantined away from the main city, and they weren't allowed to come in. In Milan, in Italy, if a family was found to be infected with the plague, their house was actually walled up, which basically means that entries and exits were blocked to prevent anyone from coming or from going. The cities of Milan and Venice were found to have a relatively small number of residents die from the plague, and these methods might have contributed. It's obviously hard to be conclusive about those sorts of things. Historical records also reveal that Pope Clement VI, who was living in France at the time, would sit in a room with two large fires burning, believing that that would purify the air. The Pope survived, and whether because of the fires or not, scientists have confirmed that this method could well have been successful, because the plague bacteria could not have survived at such high temperatures, and the fleas wouldn't have liked the heat either. For many people, simply fleeing an infected town or village was still the best form of protection, although to be fair, it was usually only the wealthy who could take advantage of this, because for the standard working class or lower class population, all they had was their homes and their belongings in their homes, and if they left them, they really had nothing. So fleeing was an option, but mainly only for the wealthy. So hopefully now you have a good idea of how illness, and specifically the Black Death, was treated in the High Middle Ages, and some of the successes and failures of these treatments. If you're ready to learn how the Black Death spread, and the trail of devastation that it tracked through Asia, Europe and Africa, then you should check out the next video, 8 History 1.4.